The runway was clear. That's what they told me. That's what every camera, every radar, every instrument in that tower said. But the man standing on runway 31L at JFK was not a malfunction. He was not a weather artifact. He was not something my 12,000 hours of flight experience could explain. He was standing at the center of the runway in the pre-dawn dark of Christmas Eve morning, and he was looking directly into my cockpit, and when I cut power and locked the brakes and screamed into the radio, the answer that came back froze my blood. Captain Rahman, the runway is clear. There is no one there. That was 3 years ago. I have told this story to my wife, to my daughters, to 2 investigators, and to one man in a small church in Queens who I went to see because I did not know where else to go. I am telling it now because I have finally found the language for what happened to me on that runway, and I owe it to every person who needs to hear it. My name is Yusuf Rahman. I am 46 years old. I have been a commercial pilot for American Airlines for 17 years. Before that, 8 years flying F-16s for the United States Air Force, deployed twice, 1 combat tour. My colleagues call me by my call sign from the Air Force, Steady, because they say I do not rattle, because they say nothing gets to me, because in 17 years of commercial aviation, I have never once broken composure in a cockpit. I broke it on Christmas Eve at 6:43 in the morning on runway 31L. Leave a comment telling me where you are and what time it is. I want to see where this reaches. But the reason Jesus came to that runway starts 3 years earlier. With a letter I couldn't bring myself to open. My parents came to the United States from Karachi in 1975. My father was a civil engineer, my mother a math teacher. They settled in Dearborn, Michigan, already home to one of the largest Arab-American communities in the country, and that is where I was born in 1978. My father was a devout Muslim. Not the kind who performed his religion for other people. The kind who put it into how he showed up, how he spoke, how he kept his word. I grew up watching that, and I thought I was learning it. I was learning the outside of it, the form, without what produced the form. That distinction would come back to me later, sitting in a cold cockpit, with my hands still on the brakes. I grew up between 2 worlds, American at school, Pakistani at home, Muslim at the mosque. I got good at reading what each context expected and delivering it. The Air Force sharpened that skill into something close to a superpower. 8 years in an F-16 teaches you to trust your training over your feelings, to make irreversible decisions at speed, and to never, under any circumstances, show what you don't know. I prayed. I fasted. I did everything a Muslim man is supposed to do. But somewhere in those years, the praying got hollow. I was doing it right without bringing anything to it. If you had asked me the last time I felt God actually received something I sent, I couldn't have answered. My younger brother Tariq was asking me about that. I didn't want to hear the question because I couldn't admit I had no answer. My call sign was Steady. I had earned it over 25 years. I did not break. I did not rattle. Whatever happened in the cockpit, I handled it. That's the man who pushed the thrust levers forward on runway 31L on Christmas Eve morning. There is someone you need to know about before the runway makes sense. His name was Tariq, my younger brother by 4 years. He was everything I was not. Loud where I was quiet, impulsive where I was careful. He drove my parents to exhaustion and he drove me to distraction, and he was the funniest person I have ever known. He was also the person in my life who paid attention to the question underneath the question. He'd let you answer, and then say, "But what did you actually mean?" Not to argue, because he genuinely wanted to know. He couldn't accept an answer he hadn't tested, which is how he ended up going to church. Tariq started going to church when he was 27. Not a mosque, a church. A small evangelical congregation in Dearborn that one of his co-workers had been attending for years. He did not announce this. He did not make a declaration. He just started going quietly on Sunday mornings, and I found out because my mother mentioned it at dinner with the specific tone she used for things she did not know how to feel about. He started reading. He started asking questions that I did not want to answer. I want to be honest about why I didn't want to answer them. I could have. I knew the Islamic view of Jesus well enough to argue it. But engaging Tariq's questions honestly would have required me to admit something out loud that I was not ready to admit, that I had been doing the religion right without feeling God on the other side of it for years. So I told him he was confused. I told him this more than once, and with more force than the argument required. And he listened, and he did not argue back, and he kept asking the questions, and I kept not answering them, and we were doing this in a quiet, persistent, loving way, right up until the January when he died. I want to be honest about my reaction, because I think it matters for what comes later. I was not angry in the way of someone defending a faith he was sure of. I was angry in the way of someone protecting something he was afraid of. If Tariq's questions were right, they pointed at a gap in me that I did not want to look at. So I dismissed them. I told my brother he was being confused by people who wanted to pull him away from his family. I said it more than once, and with more force than the argument required. Tariq died in a car accident when he was 31, black ice on I-94 in January. He was driving back to Dearborn from a church event in Ann Arbor. And I want to say that plainly, not as a wound but as a fact, because it is part of the story. He was at a church event. He died at the scene before the paramedics arrived. He left a letter, not addressed to me specifically. He had written one letter with all of our names on it, and whoever found it was supposed to give each person their part. It was tucked inside the Bible he had been reading, which his wife Layla found the morning after. She called and told me about the letter and mailed it to me. I read the first 2 paragraphs in the car in the airport parking structure, where I'd gone to have a few minutes alone before going back inside. Then I folded it, put it in my coat pocket, transferred it to the drawer of my nightstand when I got home. Did not open it again for 3 years. I told myself I would read it when I was ready. This is something people say when they know they are never going to be ready, but they need a reason not to do it now. The grief was real. I do not want you to think I was unaffected. Tariq was the funniest person I have ever known. He was irreplaceable in a specific and irreplaceable way, and losing him was the kind of loss that does not close, that you simply learn to carry without letting it slow your stride. But under the grief, there was something else. Something I am only able to name now that I have the distance. I was angry at him for what he had been moving toward, and I was angry at myself for being angry at that. And I was angry, underneath both of those, at the question that his death had left open. What if he was right? That question was in the letter. I knew it was in the letter. That is why I did not open it. I flew. I came home. I prayed 5 times a day. I coached my daughter's soccer team on Saturdays. I was by every external measure fine, a functional and competent man living a functional and competent life, with a drawer in his nightstand that he did not open. Nadia knew. She always knows. She would look at me sometimes with an expression that I recognized as the one she used when she was deciding whether to say something. And then she would decide not to. And I would be grateful. And we would both continue. She had learned that I would come to certain things on my own, or not at all. So she prayed. I did not know until after how consistently she had been praying. Not just general prayers. Specific prayers for me for the question I was not asking. She had been praying about the drawer. Leave a comment with the word runway. Because what happened there is the center of everything. Christmas Eve morning. My daughters were still asleep when I left. Nadia was up. She was always up when I had early departures, a habit from our first year together that had continued without either of us formally deciding to continue it. She would make tea. We would sit at the kitchen table and talk for a few minutes in the quiet of the house before I left. It was a short conversation by design. I had to be at the airport. But it was ours, and I had never taken a pre-dawn flight without it. Our daughters are 14 and 11. They were asleep in their rooms. I stopped at each door before I came downstairs, which I also always do, in the specific way of a father who has spent 17 years flying away from his children and coming back, who has learned not to leave without accounting for where everyone is. Nadia had tea ready when I came down. She was at the kitchen table with her hands around the mug, and she had the expression that I recognized as the one she used when she had been thinking something for a while and had decided to say it. She said, "Yusuf, I need you to promise me something." I said, "What?" She said, "If you feel anything unusual today, I need you to pay attention to it. Don't explain it. Don't fly past it. Just pay attention." I looked at her. I said, "Nadia, where is this coming from?" She said, "I've been praying this week. Something has been on my mind about you. I don't know what it is. I just know that I need you to promise me that if something happens today, you will not rationalize it away." I said, "I have a JFK to LAX turn. I will be home by 8 tonight. Nothing is going to happen." She said, "I know, but promise me anyway." I said, "Nadia." She said, "Yusuf, please." I said, "All right, I promise." She kissed me and I picked up my bag and I went to the car. It was 4:30. The street was dark. The temperature was 28 degrees. Christmas Eve at 4:30 in the morning in Dearborn, then on the Belt Parkway through Queens in the dark. The city in those hours has a particular quality, not the stillness of a sleeping city, because New York does not sleep, but a reduced quality, the volume turned down, the specific light of street lamps on wet pavement. I had made this drive hundreds of times. That morning I thought about Nadia's expression. I thought about her saying something has been on my mind about you. I thought about the fact that she had not told me the content of what she had been praying, which meant it was something she thought I was not ready to hear. I thought about the draw. Then I did what I always do, which is put the personal compartment away and opened the professional compartment and thought about the flight. In the terminal I met my first officer, David Park. He had been with me on 8 flights over the past year. 32 years old, calm, thorough, the kind of co-pilot you want on a long haul. We went through the briefing, the weather, the flight plan. JFK to LAX, scheduled departure 6:35, 214 passengers, a full plane on the night before Christmas. I want to tell you about Eleanor Marsh. I did not know her name until 2 days after the flight. What I knew at the time was that when we were boarding at gate 23, a flight attendant came to the cockpit door and said there was a passenger who wanted to speak with me briefly before departure. This is unusual, but not unprecedented. Sometimes elderly passengers need reassurance. Sometimes there's a medical issue. Sometimes someone just wants to express concern about the flight. She was 71 years old, compact, white-haired, with the specific self-possession of a woman who has been certain about certain things for a very long time. She was carrying a small Bible, the kind with a worn cover that gets that way from being read rather than displayed. She said, "Captain, I am sorry to bother you. I know you have a lot to do, but I need to tell you something." I said, "Of course. What is it?" She said, "This morning while I was praying, I have been on this flight before and I always pray before I board. This morning I felt very strongly that I should not pray for the flight. I should pray for the pilot. I don't usually know who the pilot is, but this morning I felt like God was saying, 'Pray for the man in the cockpit. He doesn't know me yet, but today he will.'" I held her gaze for a moment. She said, "I know how that sounds. I am sorry. I just felt like I needed to tell you." I thanked her. I meant it. She went back to her seat. I went back to my pre-flight. I want to be honest about what I thought in that moment. I thought, kind woman, strong faith, Christmas morning emotions. I processed it the way I process most things I cannot categorize. I filed it and moved on. But I noticed that the feeling I had when she said those words, "He doesn't know me yet, but today he will," stayed with me in a way that I could not entirely file away. It was not anxiety. It was more like the sensation of something clicking into alignment that I did not know had been misaligned. I pushed it down and ran the checklist. We began our taxi at 6:20. The terminal was full behind us. 214 people settling into their seats, stowing bags, checking phones for Christmas messages. Families going to see families, people going home. During the taxi, I became aware of something I cannot entirely describe, and I want to try anyway because it is important context for what happened on the runway. The cockpit is a controlled environment. I have spent 18,000 hours in cockpits. I know what a cockpit feels like. The specific quality of the air, the specific sounds of the avionics cooling fans and the hydraulic system and the pneumatics. I know what jet fuel smells like and what the recycled cabin air smells like and what the difference between them is. After 18,000 hours, the cockpit is more familiar to me than most rooms I inhabit. That morning, somewhere during the taxi from gate 23 to the hold, short of 31L, something changed in the cockpit. I cannot tell you what it was precisely. I have tried to find the right word for 3 years, and the closest I can get is, a quality of attention entered the cockpit that had not been there before. Like being in a room alone and then suddenly having the physical sensation that someone else is in the room without seeing anyone. That particular shift in the quality of the air. And a scent. I know this sounds strange, and I am aware of how it sounds. A scent that was not jet fuel, and not the cabin air system, and not anything I could identify. It was clean, almost sweet. The closest reference I have is the way the air smells after rain on dry pavement, that specific mineral freshness. But that is not quite right either. David noticed my expression, and I told him it was nothing. The sensation did not go away. It moved with me. It was present during the final hold short checklist. It was present when the tower cleared us to the runway. I pushed the thrust levers forward at 6:42. I want to be precise about what happened next, because precision is how I think, and it is the only way I know to make people understand that what I am describing is not imagination. I know the difference between imagination and instrument data. I have been trained to know the difference. What I am about to tell you is instrument data. The CFM56 engines on an A321 produce 40,000 pounds of thrust. I know what that acceleration feels like in my body, the way I know what my own heartbeat feels like. We began moving down the runway, and the world outside began to slide past in the way that precedes flight, the familiar sensation of transition from ground to air. At 47 knots, not V1, not anywhere near the committed point, I saw him. A man was standing at the center of the runway, not at the edge, not in the grass beyond the shoulder, dead center, at the runway center line, in the direct path of our aircraft, in the full beam of our nose landing lights. He was approximately 800 feet ahead of us. We were closing at 47 knots and accelerating. He was not running. He was not gesturing wildly. He was not doing what a person does when they have ended up on an active runway by accident, which I have been told involves panic, which involves moving. He was completely, unnaturally still. I need to describe him as precisely as I can because I have been asked many times, and I want to answer it with the same precision I bring to everything in a cockpit. He had long, dark hair that was not moving in the slipstream of a 300,000-pound aircraft accelerating toward him. He had a beard. He was wearing clothing that was simple, not elaborate, not ceremonial, nothing that announced itself. He was not tall, not short. He was built like a man who works with his hands. What I noticed was not his appearance. What I noticed was that he was the only completely still object in my visual field. Everything else was moving, the runway lights passing on either side at increasing speed, the heat shimmer at the far end of the runway, the early sky, the edge of the terminal in my peripheral vision. He was the only fixed point. And he had his right hand raised, palm out, not above his head, not a frantic wave. His arm was extended in front of him, palm facing me, the gesture of someone who has all the authority in the world and does not need to perform it. He meant, stop. I cut the thrust levers to idle, deployed spoilers, maximum wheel braking. The deceleration was severe. 214 people were thrown forward against their seatbelts. I heard it through the flight deck door. A child screamed. A bag hit the floor somewhere in the cabin, voices coming up fast, confused and scared. Then, the chief flight attendant on the intercom, calm and steady the way they train you to be when you are not. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We have stopped as a precautionary measure. Everything is under control. A woman up front was crying. I could hear that too. David had backed me up the moment I cut power. That is what a good first officer does. He reads the situation before he reads the captain. I was on the radio before the aircraft had fully stopped. JFK Tower, American 2247, aborting departure, figure on the runway, figure on the runway. Tower came back immediately. American 2247, this is JFK Tower. Runway 31L is confirmed clear. Visual negative, radar negative. No personnel on the runway. In that moment, I understood exactly what was happening to my career. An abort at V1 or above, when the aircraft is committed, is standard procedure. You train for it. It is expected. But an abort at 47 knots, before V1, with no mechanical fault, no bird strike, no weather, no documented hazard of any kind, based on a figure that Tower says isn't there. That goes in a report. That report goes to a flight safety board. The board asks questions. The pilot answers. And if the pilot's answer is, I saw a man on the runway who turned out not to exist, a career that took 25 years to build starts coming apart. I knew all of this in the 3 seconds between releasing the thrust levers and stopping the aircraft. I knew it, and I kept the brakes locked. I had stopped the aircraft. The man was still there. Closer now. 500 feet. The landing lights were full on him. David said very quietly, "Captain, I don't see anyone." I said, "I see him." David scanned. He leaned forward until his forehead almost touched the windscreen. He said, "Yusuf, there is nothing out there." I did not look at David. I kept my eyes on the man on the runway. I said, "David, I see a man at the center line. He is standing still. He has his hand up. I am not moving this aircraft." David was quiet for 2 seconds. Then he said, "Understood. I'm with you." I did not take my eyes off the man. His expression, I'm going to try to describe this carefully, because it is the thing I come back to most often in the 3 years since. It was not urgency. It was not alarm. It was not the expression of someone who has issued a command and is waiting anxiously to see if it is obeyed. It was patient. The specific patience of someone who knows exactly how this ends. The patience of someone who has done this before and is simply waiting for the correct thing to happen, which he has already arranged and which is going to happen on schedule. He looked at me the way someone looks at you when they know you. Then, while I watched, he lowered his hand. He turned. And he was not there anymore. Not walking away, not stepping off the runway. He was there, and then he was not there. The runway was empty, and the runway lights were passing through the place where he had been, and there was nothing. The tower dispatched emergency vehicles immediately. Port Authority police units, airport fire trucks, 2 runway safety vehicles, a full emergency response for a potential runway incursion. They came fast. I had stopped the aircraft at the beginning of the runway, well short of where I had seen him, and the vehicles spread out and searched every meter between my position and the far end of the runway. They found nothing. No footprints on the wet asphalt. No indication that any person had crossed the perimeter fence. Every camera in the JFK runway surveillance system, and JFK has redundant coverage of every square foot of active runway, showed nothing on runway 31L during our takeoff roll except our aircraft. The supervisor at the ground radar told me in a flat, careful voice that the runway had been confirmed clear before our departure, had remained clear throughout our roll, and was clear at the time of my abort. He was not doubting my report. He was telling me what his equipment showed. I said, "I understand what your equipment showed." He said, "Yes, sir. 22 minutes is how long we held on that runway. A commercial aircraft with 214 passengers, Christmas Eve morning, holding on a runway at JFK while emergency vehicles searched an empty runway because the captain said he saw a man standing on it. I am telling you this so you understand the position I was in. I was going to have to explain this to American Airlines. I was going to have to explain it to the FAA. I was going to have to explain it to 214 passengers who had somewhere to be on Christmas Eve. And my explanation was, I saw a man on the runway who was not there. At 6:51, 9 minutes into the hold, the supervisor's scope changed. A transponder signal appeared. It had not been there before, Not because a new aircraft entered the airspace, but because a transponder that had been dark came back online. The radar track filled in backward as the system reconstructed the path from the last known position. Medical helicopter, based at Teterboro, New Jersey, had experienced simultaneous failures of both comm radios and the transponder during flight, which rendered it invisible to ATC and unable to communicate. It had been flying on a direct routing from Albany, New York, to NYU Langone Medical Center in Manhattan. It was carrying a donor heart. The heart had been removed from a patient in Albany General Hospital. It had a viability window. There was a man at NYU Langone on the table. 2 weeks after Christmas Eve, I learned that man survived the transplant. He was 44 years old. He never knew that the heart that saved him crossed the same sky where Jesus stopped my aircraft. I never met him. I don't need to. The helicopter had crossed runway 31L at 6:43 minutes and 17 seconds, at an altitude of 283 feet above the runway surface. I had begun my takeoff roll at 6:42 and 12 seconds. I had aborted at 6:42 and 41 seconds, 29 seconds into the roll, at 47 knots, still on the ground. If I had continued the roll, if I had not seen what I saw and stopped, we would have been wheels up approximately 43 seconds after brake release. We would have been climbing through 250 feet when the helicopter crossed our path. The two aircraft would have been in the same piece of sky at the same time. I have run the numbers enough times that I have stopped running them. The conclusion does not change. David, when the supervisor briefed us on the helicopter, went very quiet. I could hear him doing the same math I was doing. Outside, the emergency vehicles were standing down. Their lights went off in sequence as each unit cleared the runway. A Port Authority officer came to the cockpit door. He had been on the runway during the search. He was 27, maybe, with the careful expression of someone who's about to ask a question he does not entirely want the answer to. He said, "Captain, can I ask you something off the record?" I said, "Yes." He said, "What did you actually see out there?" I told him what I saw, all of it. The figure at the center of the runway, the raised hand, the patience of his expression, the way he turned and simply was not there anymore. The officer listened. When I finished, he said, "I am not going to write that part in my report." I said, "I understand." He said, "But you should tell someone who can hear it right." I said, "I am working on who that is." We completed the flight. The passengers were told there had been a mandatory runway hold due to an unresolved traffic advisory. Most of them accepted this without visible distress. A few were frustrated about their connections. One woman in row 7, I learned later, who had been praying the whole time we were on the ground, said she felt like something important had happened, but she didn't know what. She didn't know yet. None of them did. I was home by 9 that night. Christmas Eve. My daughters were still up. Nadia had kept them up, and they were in the living room with the lights on the tree going and a movie playing that they had seen enough times to quote. When I came through the door, they looked up, and there was the particular relief in their faces that children have when a parent comes home and the house becomes itself again. I held both of them for a moment. My older daughter, Amira, who is 14 and observes things the way her mother observes things, carefully and without announcement, said, "Dad, are you okay?" I said yes. It was a long day. She nodded. She looked at my face and decided to accept the answer, which is what she does when she suspects the answer is partial, but understands that this is not the moment to push. After we got the girls to bed, which was later than usual because it was Christmas Eve, and they had cousins to call and messages to send, Nadia and I sat at the kitchen table. She made tea. She looked at me the way she had looked at me when I came through the door, the look that means she already knows something and is waiting to see if I am going to say it. I said, "I need to tell you what happened today." She said, "Yes, you do." I told her everything. Not the official version, the real version. The scent in the cockpit during the taxi. Eleanor Marsh at the gate. Her words. What she said the instruction had been. what I saw when I pushed the thrust levers forward, the man at the center of the runway, the raised hand, the patient expression, the way he turned and was simply not there, the 22 minutes, the helicopter, the heart, the math. Nadia listened without interrupting, which is her way. She has a quality of attention that is rare. She is not thinking about what she is going to say while you are talking. She is listening. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. She said, "Yusuf, do you know who you saw?" I said, "I think I know what you believe I saw." She said, "What do you believe?" I said, "I don't know yet. I know he was there. I know he was not there when the cameras looked. I know the helicopter would have been in our airspace 43 seconds after we lifted off. I know a woman in the gate area prayed for me by name at 6 in the morning when I hadn't been assigned to the flight yet. Those are things I know." She said, "And who arranged all of those things?" I did not answer. She got up from the table. She went to the desk in the corner of the kitchen where she keeps things she has been trusted to keep for me. She came back with an envelope, Tariq's handwriting, my name. She put it on the table in front of me. She said, "It's time, Yusuf." I looked at the envelope for a long moment. Then I picked it up. I looked at the envelope. My brother's handwriting. 4 years in a drawer. She put her hand over mine, and she left me alone with it. I am not going to tell you everything in that letter. Some of it belongs to me and Tariq and to no one else. There is a section that is just the two of us and what our childhood was and what we were to each other, and I am keeping that. But there is a part I need to share. Tariq had written about his faith the way he wrote about everything, directly, specifically, without the soft edges that people sometimes put on things they think you cannot handle. He wrote, "I know you think I got confused. I know you think someone sold me something. I need you to know that what I found is the most real thing I have ever touched, more real than the cockpit, more real than the Air Force, more real than anything either of us grew up with, not because those things aren't real, but because this is the ground underneath all of them." He wrote, "I am not asking you to agree with me tonight. I am not asking you to believe something you don't believe. I am asking you to leave the question open, because if he is who he says he is, he doesn't need your help finding you. He will come to where you are. He will come to where you are." My brother wrote that sentence 4 years before I sat on a runway at JFK at 6:43 in the morning and watched a man with a raised hand stand in my path. I held the letter at that kitchen table for a long time. Then I put it flat on the table, and I put both my hands on it the way you put your hands on something that has weight, that has substance, that you need to feel under your palms to believe is real. Tariq had been right. Not about the theology I would have to work out later, not about the implications I would have to think through over months and years. About the essential thing, about what he said would happen. He came to where I was. He came to a runway at JFK at 6:43 on Christmas Eve morning. He came with a raised hand and patient eyes and the complete foreknowledge of what I would do when I saw him. He arranged a medical helicopter with a broken transponder and a donor heart and 22 minutes of investigation and a port authority officer with a question he was afraid to write in his report. He arranged 3 years in a drawer, a letter I was not ready to read, a man who had prayed for me all the way to the gate, and Nadia who had been praying in Dearborn since I do not know exactly when. He came to where I was. I sat at that kitchen table on Christmas Eve with my brother's letter, and I understood that the man on the runway was not an anomaly to be investigated. He was the answer to the question Tariq had been praying I would ask. I will tell you what I did in the weeks after. I found Eleanor Marsh. The airline had her contact information, and I asked permission to reach out to her, and she had left a note with customer service that said the pilot could contact her if he wanted to. She lived in Queens. I called her. She said, "I have been waiting for this call." I said, "How did you know to pray for me?" She said, "I just knew." The way you know things in prayer sometimes, you're asking for one thing and the answer comes for something adjacent. I was praying for safe travel and I heard, not the flight. The pilot. I said, "What did you hear exactly?" She said, "Pray for the man in the cockpit. He doesn't know me yet. But today he will." She said it the way you repeat something you have memorized, precisely without hedging. I said, "Eleanor, when did you hear that?" She said, "About 6 in the morning. I was in the gate area. We hadn't boarded yet." I said, "I was still on the Belt Parkway at 6 in the morning. I wasn't even at the airport. I hadn't been assigned to the flight." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Yes, I know." I said, "You know what that means?" She said, "I know what it means to me. I think you know what it means to you." She said, "Captain Yusuf, I have been a Christian for 50 years. I have heard from God many times, and I have sometimes doubted what I heard, and sometimes I was wrong, and sometimes I was right, and sometimes I did not know for years which it was. But this one I never doubted for a moment, because the instruction was specific. Pray for this man who doesn't know me yet. Not the flight, not the people on the plane, this one man." She said, "And then you came and knocked on my window and asked me to come speak to you." I said, "Actually, it was the flight attendant who came to get you." She said, "No, I mean I knocked on your window on the runway. I sent a message while we were holding. Captain Rahman, if you want to know what I heard, I'm in row 12. I had not known that. I had received a message from the cabin crew that a passenger wanted to speak with me, but I had not known the passenger had initiated it. She said, "I wanted you to find out what the instruction was before we landed, because I was afraid you would get off the plane in Los Angeles and I would never see you again, and you would never know." We talked for another 40 minutes. She told me that her husband had died 3 years earlier, that she had been flying home for Christmas to be with her daughter after the first Christmas alone, that she had prayed all morning before the flight the way she always prayed before flying, not from anxiety but from habit, because she and her husband had always prayed together before travel, and she was still doing it alone. She said, "When you stopped the aircraft, I knew why. Not the official reason, the real reason. I felt something change in the cabin, like a pressure shift. And I heard him say, 'It's done.' I said, 'You heard him say that?' She said, 'Yes, it is done.' She said, 'I think you know what that means.' I said, 'Yes, ma'am, I think I do.' She is 74 now. She lives in Forest Hills, Queens. We speak every few weeks. She tells me her daughter has started coming to church with her. I tell her my daughters ask questions that I don't always know how to answer, and she tells me that is how it is supposed to be, and that the questions are the point. She said once, 'Your brother must have been something.' I said, 'He was the funniest person I have ever known.' She said, 'I think you'll see him again.' I think so too. I found a church, not a mosque, a church. A small, unimpressive building on a residential street in Dearborn. The kind of building that has been there long enough that it is simply part of the neighborhood, with a sign out front that lists service times in English and Arabic and Korean. I had driven past it many times. I had not gone in. 6 weeks after Christmas Eve, I went in. I did not go in looking for a transaction or a program or a spiritual community. I went in with my brother's letter in my coat pocket and a question I could no longer leave in a drawer. I went in because the face on the runway was not going away, and I needed to say out loud to someone who would understand what I was actually asking. The pastor's name was Caleb Ford. He was 38, younger than me, a black man from Detroit who had been at this church for 7 years. He had the specific patience of someone who has heard hard questions and does not need to make them simpler than they are. I sat in his office for 2 hours. I told him everything: the Air Force, the Islam that had become performance, Tariq, the drawer, Nadia's prayer, Eleanor Marsh at the gate, the scent in the cockpit, the runway, the raised hand, the helicopter, the heart, the math, all of it. When I finished, he said, "What do you need?" I said, "I need to know if it was real. Not the helicopter. I can prove the helicopter. I need to know if the man on the runway is who I think he is. He said, I cannot prove that to you the way you can prove a flight path. I cannot give you instrument data. What I can tell you is that what you're describing is consistent with who he is. He goes where people are not expecting him. He stops things. He shows up in the middle of situations that have every reason not to involve him, and then changes the math. He said, and he waits. He is patient in a way that people are not patient. I thought about 3 years in a drawer. I thought about what Tariq had written. He doesn't need you to go looking. He will come to where you are. He said, Yusuf, I can tell you the testimony of 2,000 years of people who describe exactly what you described. I can tell you what the text says he claims about himself. I can sit here and answer your questions for as long as you want to ask them. But I think you know what you saw. I said, yes. He said, then the question isn't whether he was there. The question is what you're going to do about it. I said, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. He said, start with the question. Just keep asking it. He can handle your questions. He has been handling your questions since before you knew you were asking them. I left his office and sat in my car in the parking lot for a long time. I had been in that church an hour and a half. I had told a stranger everything. I had heard him say, I think you know what you saw. And I did know. I had known since the moment he turned. I just hadn't said it yet. I sat in the parking lot and I said it. Out loud. Alone in the car. In Arabic first, because that is the language of my prayers. And then in English, because I wanted to be sure I was saying exactly what I meant. I said, Jesus, I know it was you on that runway. I don't know everything about what that means yet, but I know it was you, and I know you knew where I would be before I did, and I'm asking you now, show me what to do next. I sat there for another 10 minutes. Then I started the car and I went home. He had been waiting while I put Tariq's letter in a drawer for 3 years. He had been waiting while I said the prayers without meaning anything by them. He came to a runway in the dark on Christmas Eve and stood there until I stopped. I did not know then exactly what it meant to follow him, or what it would cost, or how Nadia would receive it, or what my parents would say. I am still learning all of that. 3 years later, I am still in the middle of the answer to those questions, and I think I will be for a long time. I want to tell you about my father. My father is 73. He is still in Dearborn. He has prayed 5 times a day his entire adult life, and he is the most genuinely good man I know. When I told him what I had decided, not on the runway that he already knew about, but what I had decided because of the runway, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, Yusuf, are you well? I said, I think I am better than I have been. He said, I do not understand this. I want to understand it, but I do not. I said, I know. I am going to try to explain it to you for the rest of my life if you will let me. He said, you are my son. Of course I will let you. We sat together for 2 hours. He asked questions. I answered them. He asked about the runway again, the details, the helicopter, the math. My father is an engineer. He trusts the math. At the end of 2 hours he said, I cannot explain the runway. I have been trying for an hour and I cannot explain it. He was quiet. Then he said, your brother would have been glad. He has not converted. I am not telling you this story as a formula that produces a specific outcome. What I am telling you is that my father said your brother would have been glad, and for a man who had not said Tariq's name out loud in 3 years, that was something. Nadia received it in the way that Nadia receives most things I do. Quietly, carefully, with more understanding than I deserve. She had known for weeks before I found the words. She said, I have been waiting for you to tell me what happened on that runway since December 24th. I said, you already knew. She said, I knew something happened that was going to change you. I have been watching you change. She said, I want to understand it too. Will you help me understand it? I said, I am trying to understand it myself. We can do it together. She said, yes, we can do it together. That was 2.5 years ago. She is in the middle of her own questions now. I am not going to put a label on where she is or where she is going because that belongs to her. The cost of what happened that morning has been real, not catastrophic, not the severing of everything, but real. There are relationships in the Dearborn community that are different now. There are conversations that require care. There is a specific kind of loneliness that comes from being in between, no longer fully inside the form of the faith I was raised in, not yet fully fluent in the one I am moving toward. I am not going to minimize that. But I want to tell you what is also true. I have not felt alone in it. There is a presence in the cockpit now that was not there before, or that I was not aware of before, and it is the same presence I felt during the taxi on Christmas Eve morning. It is steady, it does not rattle. It is there before the first checklist item, and it is there on final approach, and it is there in the gate after the passengers have deplaned. He is there. What I know is what I have known since I sat at the kitchen table with Tariq's letter at 2 in the morning on Christmas Eve. He came for me before I came for him. When he stood on that runway with his hand raised and his eyes on my cockpit, he was not surprised to see me. He had known exactly where I would be. In the 3 years since that morning, I have not stopped flying. I want to say something to every Muslim watching this, because I know you are watching and I know what questions you are asking, because they were my questions. I am not telling you to abandon your family. I am not telling you to abandon your heritage. I am not telling you that the faith you were raised in was worthless. My father is the finest man I know, and he has prayed 5 times a day his entire life, and I will not disrespect what has shaped him and shaped me. What I am telling you is what I could not have told you 4 years ago. The question Tariq was asking is not a question you can file away permanently. You can put it in a drawer. I put it in a drawer for 3 years. But the drawer stays there. The question stays in the drawer. I am telling you that if you let the question open, there is someone on the other side of it who has been waiting with the patience I saw in a man on a runway who had all the time in the world while 37 tons of aircraft came at him. He does not need you to go looking. He will come to where you are. My brother wrote that 4 years before he came to where I was. To every person watching this, Muslim, Christian, skeptic, someone who does not know what they are, who has something in a drawer they have been not opening. I cannot promise you a runway and a helicopter and the specific arithmetic of collision avoidance. I can tell you that he is there before you are looking for him, and that he arranges things with a precision that no instrument in any tower can account for. He knew I would be on that runway before I had been assigned to the flight. He sent a 71-year-old woman from Queens to pray for me by name at 6 in the morning. He arranged a donor heart and a broken transponder and 22 minutes of emergency response to show me a runway that every instrument said was empty. The runway was empty. He was right about that. He was just more than the instruments could measure. I have flown 112 flights since that morning. Before every flight, after the final checklist item, when the aircraft is ready and the passengers are boarded and everything that can be verified has been verified, I say 4 words that David has heard enough times that he no longer asks about them, though once he looked at me sideways when he heard me say it and nodded in a way that told me he was thinking about the runway. I say, guide my hands. 4 words. It is not a complicated prayer, but it is the most honest one I have ever said, because it is the one I actually mean every time I say it. It is the recognition that I am not, in the end, the controlled environment, that there is something in the airspace that no instrument can account for, and that I have met it, and that I know whose it is. It is the most honest prayer I know how to make. To anyone who has a drawer, a question, a letter, something a person who loved you left behind that you are not ready for, I want to tell you something I learned too late, and not too late at the same time. The drawer does not disappear. The question does not go away because you filed it, and the one the question is about is patient in a way that makes steady look impatient. He is not in a hurry. He knows where you are going to be. Write the word runway in the comments. Let me see where this reaches today. The runway was clear. That is what every instrument said. That is what every camera showed. That is what the tower recorded. He was there anyway. He is always there anyway. In the places the instruments cannot reach. May Jesus walk with you today and in every day that is still ahead of you. Amen.